Hello and welcome to lesson 4 on the Olivet Discourse. And by that I mean what Jesus said on the Mount of Olives not long before his crucifixion, where he predicted things about the future. And in the last lesson we had gone through Matthew chapter 24 verse 3, and we're ready for verses 4 to 8. We're going to look at verses 4 to 8 in particular in this lesson, but actually to get the context, I'm going to read a whole passage around it just to keep the context in mind. So Matthew 23 verse 38 to 24 verse 16 here says, "Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down." As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation, and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains." So, getting that whole context, again, you remember Jesus sat down on the Mount of Olives and said there would not be one stone left upon another. And his disciples said, "When will these things be?" Well, the destruction of Jerusalem, because of that, was one of these things. But I believe these things also includes what Jesus said before that, while he was still at the temple, before he went and sat down with his disciples, because the destruction of Jerusalem would have been this thing, only one thing. And Jesus had just talked about their house being left desolate, and scroll back up here. "Behold, your house is being left to you desolate, for I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So these things, I believe, include not only the destruction of Jerusalem, but this time when Jesus would come. They wouldn't see him until then, but he would come and they would say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," which is the same thing that they said as he was entering Jerusalem before his crucifixion on the donkey. "Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord." Well, he was coming and entering as the king. Zechariah said, "Behold, your king comes to you on a donkey, meek and humble." So that was a kingly entry, and they received him by saying this, "Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord." So I believe that's talking about coming as a king. And so there was one sign for two things that Jesus mentioned, or that the disciples questioned, "Tell us, when will these things happen?" These things, as I said again, "and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So this coming, I believe, refers back to blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord, a kingly coming. So the end of the age would be the end of the age of them not having a king and being under Gentile domination. That's my view of what these verses are talking about. So then we also want to make an overview of Matthew 24, 4 to 16. We're looking at verses 4 to 8 in particular, but to get the context more. The wars, earthquakes, and famines are the things that the disciples to whom Jesus spoke would hear of in their lifetime. We like to say when there's an earthquake, we hear of, oh, that means Jesus is going to come back soon. That's a pretty common approach. But when he was speaking to them, he told them, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, etc. What did that mean to the people that were sitting there? Would they hear of wars and rumors of wars in their lifetime? Well, there were rumors of wars in their lifetime. And also here in the original Greek, the word for hearing is accompanied by the helping verb mello, which means about to happen. So the Greek word for to hear, or I hear, is akuo. But also the word mello is used, you are about to hear soon. So they would hear, and they would hear soon, not other people hearing 2,000 years later of the wars and rumors of wars. So these wars, famines, and earthquakes, I believe we're speaking of, or Jesus was speaking of events that would occur soon, and the people that he was speaking to would hear of them. I also want to point out there's a logical flow to what Jesus said. The disciples asked, when would be the end of the age? And Jesus responds saying, don't let the false Christs deceive you. Luke 21:8, here below, they will say, I am he, and the time is near also. So part of the message, at least, of the false Christs were that the time was near. Well, the time of what? What were these false Christs saying were near? The preterist view about the end of the age is that it is the destruction of the temple, and therefore the age of the sacrifices and the temple worship and all would end. That doesn't make sense that these false Christs were referring to that, because Jesus was saying that's going to happen. There's not one stone upon another. They'd be agreeing with him. Maybe they were saying, oh, instead of in 70 AD, it'll happen in 65 AD or something. And of course, it depends on when the Gospels were written. It would have to be after they were written. So, in other words, I think it relates to when they say the time is near, the false Christ. I think it's relating to what I was saying. I believe the end of the age is the end of the age of the Gentile domination of the Jewish people and them without having a king. That age was about to end. Well, a false Christ would be like the son of David was, the Messiah would be the son of David. David was a warrior, and he defeated all the nations around him. And, part of the idea of a Christ and the Jewish anticipation at that time especially was, well, that he would be a military leader like David and would defeat the Romans. And so I think when they're saying the false Christ, they're saying the time is near. I think the idea is that the time is near, that we'll defeat the Romans, and the Roman Empire was the last of the four empires prophesied by Daniel, and so then we'd have a king, and our kingdom would be set up, and all that. So they asked Jesus about the end of the age. He's saying, watch out for false prophets, and will be saying, or false Christs, excuse me, not prophets. He talks about false prophets later, but they would be saying the time is near. And so I believe he's talking about the time that they would defeat the Romans is near. But Jesus, what does he say? He says, going back up here to look in Matthew These things, verse 8, these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. And in verse 6, but that is not yet the end. When you hear these wars and rumors of wars, that's not the end. So he's saying the end is not yet. Well, I think he's saying that the end of them being dominated by the Gentiles has not yet come. I think that fits the flow of the context very well here. So he says the end is not yet, and then he talks about what will happen. This last verse, the gospel will be preached in the whole world as the testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So there's other things that have to happen before the end comes. So this list of things that happen are not necessarily all happening before the destruction of Jerusalem. Because what he's doing is he's not giving a chronology of the events happening before Jerusalem is destroyed. He's giving the reason they should flee. The reason they should flee is that the end is not yet. Well, yeah, you're not going to defeat the Romans. Wouldn't that make sense to be why you should flee when an army surrounds you? You're not going to win, therefore flee. So this word therefore in verse 15 is very important. That word means there's a reason. He's telling them a reason. The reason is what he said previously. And just listing the events happening before Jerusalem would be defeated by the Romans is not giving the reason they should flee. Well, the reason is they're going to lose. They're not going to defeat the Romans. So the end is not yet. Now, I'm saying that to give the whole overall context of what I think he's saying in this passage, so that when we look at Matthew 24, verses 4 to 8, in a little more detail, you can see where I'm coming from. So we'll go down here and look at Matthew 24, verses 4 to 5, and also look at where these verses are in the parallel passage, the corresponding ones where they're saying the same thing, basically. So Matthew 24, verses 4 and 5. And Jesus answered and said to them, see to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. Is he saying mislead them into another religion? They will say, they will come in his name. In other words, they're Christians. They're saying that there's a couple options. One is they're Christians and they're saying, I'm the Christ. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. The other one is saying they're coming in the authority of the Messiah, saying, I am the Christ. So either way, the point is, are they misleading people into another religion? Not the, or are they misleading them about the time? I'm sorry, I kind of fumbled on that part of it. Really, my point is, I think they're misleading them about the time of when the end will come. When he's saying they'll mislead many, I'm the Christ and mislead many. I'll read Mark and Luke here, those passages, and you might get an idea of why I'm saying that. Many will come in my name saying, I am he, and will mislead many. Luke 21:8. And he said, see to it that you are not misled, for many will come in my name saying, I am he, and the time is near. Do not go after them. So they are being misled in two ways. One is the person saying that they are the Christ or they are he. No, they're not. Okay. The other way they're being misled is they're saying the time is near. No, it isn't. It isn't near. So I think this fits with the interpretation that these false Christs were those saying, I'm the Christ, I'm going to come and defeat the Romans. It's time to defeat the Romans. That's my point there. So they're misleading them in two ways. About their person is one way, that saying they're the Christ. there. I am he, meaning I am he that will defeat the Romans. And they're misleading them about the time. So he says, do not go after them. Don't follow them. Okay, well, I can read this, but it's pretty much what I just said. But let me read it. It's more thought through and concise. Jesus warns his disciples about being misled by false Christs, that is, messiahs. In particular, in Luke 21:8, they will say the time is near. I believe they were saying that the time is near to defeat the Romans and restore the kingship to Israel. It was expected that the Messiah, like David, would be a military leader. These false messiahs would be military leaders attempting to raise followers to fight against Rome. So don't go after them means like don't join their army. That's a comment throwing in here. This actually happened in history. There were military leaders who rose and said they would lead them to defeat Rome. The reason the Romans destroyed Jerusalem is that the Jewish people rebelled and fought against Rome. I believe this is what Jesus spoke in the following passage. So if you think about it, the Romans did come and destroy Jerusalem in 70 AD. But before then, they came and destroyed Jerusalem because the Jewish people rebelled and fought against Rome and tried to throw off their rulership. When you read the Gospels, the Romans are ruling and there's tax collectors and everything's at least not in the middle of wars and battles. They're subjected to the Romans. They're not fighting against them, trying to throw them off. That had to happen for the Romans to come and destroy Jerusalem. They're not going to just come destroy Jerusalem for no reason when, hey, they're ruling them, they're paying their taxes, and it's all to Rome's advantage to keep things going how they are. So the wars and the people rebelling against the Romans and saying that, hey, follow me, we'll defeat them, is really what caused the Romans to come and destroy Jerusalem and the temple. So anyhow, I said I believe this is what Jesus was speaking about in the following passage here in Luke. This is not a parallel passage, but I think it's a very, very pertinent. It could be a parallel passage. I don't know. The chronology in the Gospels is not necessarily in verse order. But anyhow, let me read the passage and you'll see what I'm talking about. Luke 17:22-24. And he said to the disciples, the days will come when you will long to see one of the days of the Son of Man, and you will not see it. They will say to you, look there, look here, do not go away, do not run after them. For just like the lightning, when it flashes out of one part of the sky, shines through the other part of the sky, so will the Son of Man be in his day. So what is this day of the Son of Man they want to see and will not see? Now, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple was not a day they wanted to see and did not see. It was a day they did not want to see but did see, just the opposite. Okay, so he's not talking about that. There's something that a day of the Son of Man that they'll want, but they won't see it. Well, it really fits that would be, they would want the Son of Man to defeat the Romans, set up the kingdom, and become the king, defeat the nations around them, set up the Israel as the great kingdom that they would like to see it be. So he says, you long to see one of the days of the Son of Man, and you will not see it. They will say to you, look there, look here, do not go away, and do not run after them. Well, this really fits the idea that there's people saying, hey, we're going to defeat the Romans. Here's somebody over east that's saying it, we'll run after him. Or here's someone over west that's saying it, I'll go run after him. No, it's not like that. It's not going to be like that. The day of the Son of Man, where the kingdom of God and the kingdom of Israel, with Israel's king reigning, it's like verse 24, for just like the lightning when it flashes out of one part of the sky, shines through the other part of the sky, so will the Son of Man be in his day. So he's saying it's not, oh, here's a leader over here on the earth, and here's a leader over here on the earth, and you got to go look for him to follow him. No, it's going to be obvious. Everybody will see it. That will be what it will be like for the Son of Man in his day, which would fit the idea of a bodily descent of Jesus from heaven. That would be something everybody would see. He doesn't directly say that here, but my point is more that this was the idea that they were wanting to see Rome defeated. And Jesus is saying, don't run here and run there after people that are saying that they will do that they can lead them to defeat Rome. And then the one that led them to defeat Rome would end up being the king, and God's kingdom on earth would be established and all that. So Matthew 24, verses 6 to 8. We just looked at verses 4 and 5. Verses 6 to 8. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And as in various places there will be famines and earthquakes, but all these are merely the beginning of birth pangs. And then in Mark 13, 7 to 8, the parallel verses. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will also be famines. These things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Very similar to what Matthew said. Luke 21, 9 to 11. When you hear of wars and disturbances, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end does not follow immediately. Then he continued by saying to them, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be great earthquakes, and in various places plagues and famines, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. So considering these passages, Jesus is saying there'll be wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, famine, that they would see, but don't be concerned, that's not yet the end. And Luke adds this thing about there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. But that's basically the content of it. Now, actually, the other wars the Romans were soon involved in at this time, as Jesus had predicted, encouraged the Jews that the time was right to rebel against Rome. So what happened was, it wasn't just the war of the Jews and the Romans, but there were other wars and disturbances happening, wars and rumors of wars. And the Jewish people took that part of the reason the war happened, there were other reasons, but part of it was they took that for, oh, here's our chance. Rome is, their efforts are divided. They have these other wars they're having to bother with. So I have a quote from Josephus, The War of the Jews, down here at the bottom is the book, Flavius Josephus, The War of the Jews, or the History of the Destruction of Jerusalem. It's very instructive to read, which I did, to help understand the Olivet Discourse and what Jesus was talking about when he spoke of the destruction of the temple, because that's exactly the history of the destruction of Jerusalem. While the temple was destroyed as part of Jerusalem being destroyed. That's exactly what he was writing about, the history of how that came about. So I will read what Josephus said, and the point of it is, it's kind of obtuse language, or language we're not used to, but the point of it is that what I was just saying, that these other wars were part of the reason that the Jews thought it was an opportune time to rebel against Rome. Now, at the time when this great concussion of affairs happened, the affairs of the Romans were themselves in great disorder. Those Jews also who were for innovations, and he kind of used that, innovations, we think of it as inventing something new, but he kind of used it as coming up with new plans and rebellion against the Romans. Those Jews also who were for innovations then arose when the times were disturbed. They were also in a flourishing condition for riches and for strength and riches, insomuch that the affairs of the East were then exceeding tumultuous, while some hoped for gain and others were afraid of loss in such troubles. For the Jews hoped that all of their nation which were beyond Euphrates would have raised an insurrection together with them. The Gauls also, in the neighborhood of the Romans, were in motion, and the Gelton were not quiet. But all was in disorder after the death of Nero, and the opportunity now offered induced many to aim at the royal power, and the soldiery effected change out of the hopes of getting money. So the bottom line of this quote is just the point that I was making, that all these wars helped encourage the Jews to rebel against Rome. So Jesus predicting that there would be wars and rumors of wars fit into the whole context. There were wars and rumors of war, and that's part of the reason the Jews rebelled. Now, the wars and rumors of wars, it's interesting, in all three of these, Jesus was saying that is not the end. And let's go back and actually look at the verses instead of what I'm saying about him. But all these are merely the beginning of birth pangs. The wars, rumors of wars, famine, and earthquake. Mark also, these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. And Luke, but the end does not follow immediately. So all of these things, the wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, famine, are not signs that the end is near. It's kind of the opposite of the way in common Christian conversations of, like I said earlier, oh, there was an earthquake, it must be Jesus is coming soon. That's not what he was talking about here. Then there was one more statement we need to talk about a little bit. There will be terrors and great signs from heaven. Well, sure, there were wars and rumors of war, but were there terrors and great signs from heaven? Well, I guess we don't get to that yet, because here's a couple indications there were earthquakes. And, well, actually, let's read this paragraph first. Let's not go so fast. Jesus said these happenings are not signs that the end is near. He said that is not the end, and they are merely the beginning of birth pangs, and the end does not follow immediately. So unlike the Jews who took them as signs that it was time to rebel against Rome and succeed, the followers of Jesus were not to take them as such signs. Now, there were also earthquakes and famines during this time. And here's a couple of verses in the Bible, actually, that talk about a famine and an earthquake before, well, in the time that the apostles were still alive, one of the signs they could see. Acts 11. Now at this time some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit that there would certainly be a great famine all over the world. And this took place in the reign of Claudius. So here was a very extensive famine all over the world. In the sense the word world is used, does not necessarily mean in Australia and South America, but the Roman world, or the known world to them. Here's an earthquake that happened during the time that the 12 were alive. Well, I don't know if all 12 of them still were at this point. I'd have to go back and look at it. But in the time that the disciples were living. Acts 16, 25 to 26. But about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns of praise to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. And suddenly there came a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison house were shaken. And immediately all the doors were opened and everyone's chains were unfastened. Well, this is an earthquake sent by God to free Paul and Silas and give them opportunity to share Jesus with the jailer. But it says it was a great earthquake. When I read this, tend to think of it as being localized. That prison house had an earthquake, but it says there was a great earthquake. It could have been much more extensive than that. Excuse me again. So if you look in history, and I won't get into that, there's resources for that. There were also other earthquakes, famines, and plagues recorded in history during this period. So um, that's something that can be, can check on the internet or whatever if you want to check it out to see if what I'm saying is true. I'm not getting into the documentation of that. It makes it too much. But, there have been wars and rumors of wars and famines and plagues and earthquake throughout history. That period of time was not an exception. So those were happening too. Now, in Luke it stated there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. So what did Josephus say about that? I have a quote here also from the same War of the Jews, or the history of the destruction of Jerusalem. And by the way, that's public domain. I downloaded it, put it on Kindle. You want to check these things out, you can download it over the internet, not a problem. So this quote is only a start of a portion in his book about these kind of things that happened. He goes on to talk about other things, but I wanted to give some documentation that those kind of things happened also during this period. So thus there was a star resembling a sword which stood over the city, would be Jerusalem, and a comet that continued a whole year. Well, there's signs in the heavens. Thus also before the Jews' rebellion and before those commotions which preceded the war, when the people were come in great crowds to the feast of unleavened bread on the 8th day of the month Xanthicus, Nisan, and at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone round the altar and the holy house that it appeared to be bright daytime, which lasted for half an hour. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend those events that followed immediately upon it. So he's talking about a star looking like a sword and a comet that lasted a whole year, and a light appearing during the nighttime and lasting for half an hour. And he goes on, if you read that passage, he goes on to talk about other things that happened. Now, Josephus is not writing scripture. And did all these things happen? Did they not happen? I can't prove it. I'm just saying there is indication from a historical account that these kind of things happened. So giving evidence that could have been the case. So I hope that was interesting and thought-provoking and would cause you to study and think about what the passage is saying here. And that's the end of lesson 4. Thank you for listening.